Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. This is a post-game edition. We're doing something a little bit different this time around, sticking around in Beaver Stadium into the evening and recording here instead of heading home and recording at our respective places, me and Daniel. Before we hit the road here, we've got a lot to discuss because Penn State got to 7-1 as we both predicted, but the method in which they reached that record was certainly a lot different, and it resulted in a 33-24 Penn State victory. But this was a matchup that was tied in the final 2 minutes. I predicted a 38-0 Penn State shutout win. I was way wrong. Las Vegas was way wrong. And this was exactly the kind of hangover situation that we thought Penn State might find itself in, but even worse than that, because they were at risk of losing to the Indiana Hoosiers today in Beaver Stadium. And Indiana was 2-20 in Big Ten matchups since 2021.
I took it on the chin last week with how wrong I was about Penn State, going to Ohio State and losing in that fashion. And it's a little bit of a happier ending for Penn State fans this week. But once again, very wrong about the way this game was going to go. I had Penn State winning 48-10. My bold prediction, I had that Daquan Hardy pick six, and I was close on that punt return. A couple degrees of separation away there, but I think that we just saw a very sluggish Penn State performance. A lot of the problems that we'd seen these past couple of weeks pop up again, and I think that they were very, very fortunate to escape with a win. We've talked about you don't want to lose to Ohio State twice, and that's definitely what almost happened today. But you look at it right now from where we stand on paper, 7-1, 4-1 in the Big Ten. You've got 4 games left this year. We know which one of those is the biggest, but you still have an opportunity ahead of you.
Yeah, so just to quickly review why we felt the way we did about the Indiana-Penn State matchup a bit. Indiana had, I just mentioned, 2-20 since 2021 in conference action, but thus far in the season, closer than expected week 1 against Ohio State, 23-3 loss. But their other Big Ten matchups leading into this one, a 44-17 defeat at Maryland, a 52-7 loss at Michigan, and then last week at home, a 31-14 loss to Rutgers. And we got a lot of directions we can go in here, but I thought it'd be best to start with how this one finished. Again, Penn State, they trailed 14-7 deep into the first half. This was a tie game, 24-24 with under 3 minutes left. But let's go a little bit before that to go to Drew Allar's first career interception. It ended the NCAA record-setting streak to start a career without an interception. It spanned, going through the math there, 17 games without that turnover. Finally showed up in one of the worst possible situations, backed up, third down. I would say pretty clearly the worst decision, the worst throw that we've seen from Drew Allar in a Penn State uniform, and it ends up gift wrapping a possession to Indiana just outside the red zone with a few minutes left here and a 3-point deficit. And I mean, Tom Allen took a knee on it and did not do much with the opportunity, but we wondered when that first mistake would happen for Drew Allar, the first mistake that leads to the other team taking the football. And here it was, and Beaver Stadium just like shut down in that moment. I think everyone was bracing for a potential heartbreaking scenario to play out here.
It's funny, listening back to Drew Allar talk about that interception after the game, and he said that he didn't realize that he was intercepted initially. Obviously, he couldn't see where the ball went, which was part of the problem because he was under duress and just kind of launched it over the middle. But he said that on these interceptions, you usually hear a big reaction from the crowd, and he didn't hear that. So he didn't really realize until he was going over to the sideline and saw the defense coming out instead of the punt unit that he had been picked off. I think that kind of speaks to what you had talked about, Tyler, with how deflating of a moment that was. I think with where we were in the game, that's not a move that gets met with boos or a huge reaction or the crowd feeling that, okay, it needs to pick up the defense now. The way that game was going, that felt like, it could be a backbreaker. And I think that Penn State and Drew Allar is really, really fortunate that Indiana went so conservative. 3 straight runs, including one on 3rd and 7, settling for a 35-yard field goal. You give the ball back to Penn State with 3 minutes left. And on the one hand, I get it because the Penn State offense had not been doing much. But, playing for overtime, that's no way to live, first of all. But, you're Indiana, you're Tom Allen, you're on the hot seat. You need to do anything you can to get a win. And I think for Indiana to really turtle up right there, when Penn State got the ball back, I was kind of like, this is going to backfire. I can really see this backfiring. And that's ultimately what happened in the game flow.
Yeah, I mean, so Indiana has that opportunity, a golden moment. They're content to take 3 rush attempts and get the field goal opportunity, which they converted a 35-yarder. That made it 24-24. At that point, we're under 3 minutes to go in this matchup. Penn State gets the ball. And after the matchup now, we've had some chances to check in with Drew Allar and some different players on this team. And after the interception, we were all wondering, what would it look like? He had some time to go to the sideline, think about it, regroup. You wrote a story with a lot of different voices about Drew Allar. I know that you've maybe got some more to put out at Lions247.com on this subject, but from everything we gathered in postgame, what does it sound like those few minutes were like in between Drew Allar's first interception and when he resurfaces on the field, needing to lead Penn State 2 points if they're going to avoid overtime?
It sounded like the players on both sides of the ball had all the confidence in the world that Drew Allar was going to get the job done. Theo Johnson, the tight end and team captain, told us that he told Drew Allar, quote, "You're the best in the country and don't forget it. That doesn't define you." And going out, Theo Johnson said that he felt that Penn State was going to make the big play. Katron Allen said that he told Drew Allar in the huddle, "Let's go win it." Before kind of he got pressed on a follow-up about that and said that it was more, "We got your back, Drew." But it just sounds like that players on both sides of the ball. You had quotes from KJ Winston and Dennis Sutton. Talked to Nick Singleton, Khalil Dinkins, Theo Johnson, Keandre Lambert-Smith. They just had all the trust in the world in Drew Allar that he was going to get this done, that he was going to find a way to bring Penn State to a victory. And I think to hear that, especially after what we saw last week in Columbus, I think that shows the trust that the team has in Drew Allar, his standing on the team, and kind of, where everyone's head is at, because from where we sit, things have looked, pretty bad. It's been, painful to watch at times. I think that, the players have acknowledged some frustrations, but, in that kind of insular bubble of the Lash building, of the Beaver Stadium sideline, that, they are behind their quarterback. They trust him. One thing that came up a couple times with Keandre Lambert-Smith and Theo Johnson when talking about that touchdown pass is that they've seen that in practice so many times. And we hear it from the defensive players too, that they know what Drew Allar looks like during the week. They've seen what he's done on some Saturdays, and that is another thing that gives them so much trust and faith in him to get the job done.
Yeah, KJ Winston said, look, that they get very competitive. They consider themselves a great defense, an elite defense. We didn't really see that today against Indiana, which is the first time we didn't see that kind of a defensive performance from the Nittany Lions in a while. But going back to this point, on the practice field, they feel like they have given Drew Allar a lot to work with and deal with going back to spring ball and his freshman year and, of course, preseason camp. And they came away convinced that he could deliver this kind of moment because they've had, where it's kind of generated by the staff or where you got pressure cooker moments in practice. And I understand that, but I still wondered for myself, would the teammates, would everybody really believe that Drew could do this until he went out and did it? There's only one way to do it. Let the ball go and trust your receiver to make a play. And he did that. A 57-yard touchdown pass to Keandre Lambert-Smith. He was actually 3 of 3 on that final possession for 78 yards, I think it was. And when you look at Drew Allar over the course of that final possession, the response was great. He's going against Indiana. He's in front of a friendly home crowd here, but there's a lot of psychological stuff in play. We talked about it coming out of the Ohio State game. Where would Drew Allar be, through this practice week as the guy that, can teammates look to him and turn to him, and is he going to take this step forward? And you get to the point deep in this matchup, he had thrown a couple touchdowns, but that interception was really glaring. And then you wonder, if Indiana can take this one in overtime, that's really going to be put a precarious situation for Penn State. I think with Drew Allar, the ability to come back and look steady in that moment says a lot about him. It says a lot about this team moving. I don't know if it necessarily means about the team moving forward, but I think a lot about the confidence internally about things. So they're going to tell us they believe in Drew. They're going to tell us that in the summer. They're going to tell us that in the spring. They're going to tell us that through the first few games. But I think seeing him do this in a moment where it was truly gut check time. You could feel the narrative around this entire 2023 squad changing in front of your eyes if things turn to disaster here against the Hoosiers. And not only was Drew Allar able to find the confidence within himself, but he's able to let it fly and believe in Keandre Lambert-Smith to come down and make that play. And maybe that's a part of this game, this passing attack generally that we haven't seen, and Drew Allar just letting it rip. And maybe got to the point where you had to, but it was a first and 10 situation. They dialed it up, a deep shot. What did you make of the confidence to make that kind of throw, and then the connection with Keandre Lambert-Smith to be the guy who gets it done?
We talked about it these past couple of weeks and even coming into the season, where we knew there was going to come a game when you needed Drew Allar to win it for you with his arm. We thought that might be last week in Columbus. And he couldn't quite get that done. But today was a really prime scenario to see that happen. And, I just think that it is probably very huge for the confidence of this team and the confidence of Drew Allar, to win a game like this with the big throw, with that sort of big play in that spot. But it was just a very, very, I think, pretty play when you talk about having that big armed 5-star quarterback back there who can make all the throws. That's kind of what you envision in a way, just throwing it up along the sideline. Keandre Lambert-Smith actually lost it for a second and then found it again to haul it in. He did the tightrope down the sideline to get into the end zone. It was just a very, very pretty play and a very pretty throw by Drew Allar. And, he had a couple of those. I think that he just throws such a pretty deep ball. He can put touch on it. He can laser it in there. He can get the ball downfield, to his receiver and hit them in the hands. But I think that play in that spot was very, very big. And I think that it showed Drew Allar's willingness to trust his arm right there, which is something that maybe we haven't seen, but they were in a spot where he needed to do that. They didn't have time to go 12 plays to get down there and punch it in on a 2-yard run out of the T formation. They needed to score, and they did it quickly.
Let me correct myself. I said he was 3 for 3 on that final drive. The second play of that drive was actually a 10-yard run for Kaytron Allen, who really came on as the game advanced. Allen on the previous play to that had an 11-yard reception on the first play of that possession. So kind of steadied them, and then boom, going for that long shot. They connect. Look, we've heard so much, and we've actually seen it quite a bit. We've seen it against air on the practice field, but there's only so many times you can hear about Drew throwing these bombs in practice and how pretty it looks until you can start to wonder if you're going to ever see it for yourself, and can you see it flash with consistency. And the consistency part is still to come, but the fact that you got some fireworks here when they needed it speaks volumes, I think, about where Drew is with his potential. And let's face it, 19 touchdowns, 1 interception on the season now through 8 career starts. And it was an ugly situation for this offense in Ohio State. We've got a lot of questions still about this passing attack, especially if Harrison Wallace is going to be out an extended period of time. We'll address that in a moment. But at the end of the deal here, after a long, arduous 8-day span, when we go back to Columbus, Drew Allar comes out the other side of this, and you'd imagine there's at least an opportunity for a reset, if not for him to hit the ground running further ahead of where he was than when they went on to the road to Ohio State. And to me, that is huge in this game, because you talk about the psychological development of your sophomore quarterback, a guy that we think Penn State's going to be counting on, for the next season and a half at least, to be the man out in front for their goals. So to see this, in a pressure cooker spot, I loved it. I loved it, and I mean, you got to imagine that they're going to come back on Sunday in the team facilities, and whether they want to tell us it or not, that finish provided some serious, I guess, it pushed them away from some self-doubt. It pushed them away from some self-doubt. And I think as long as you can kind of shut the door on self-doubt right now for your young quarterback and for this team, you're going to give yourself a shot, because that is what I think ultimately leads to these stringing games of hangover effects, internal self-doubt. And right now, I think they were able to maybe exercise some of that in the final few minutes, especially on offense.
These last 8 days, this last week was, I think, probably pretty trying at times for Drew Allar and for Penn State. We saw how that game at Ohio State ended. We heard what Drew Allar was saying. We saw how much that loss hurt him. And we know how hard it was for the team as a whole, especially given how that defense played. And to see how the team came out today, where the defense is getting gashed, the offense isn't doing anything, nothing's really going right. And to see Penn State move its way through that and navigate that way to the end, I think is really big. The key now becomes spinning this forward. You finally beaten the adversity. I think that this is something that can really help the team moving forward. I still maintain what we were saying going into that Ohio State game, that it was perfectly fine that that team had not been tested, and that you would much rather have that than having, getting getting Northwestern or Illinois really pushing you to the wire. But I think that having these experiences, especially with this Michigan game looming in 2 weeks, I think is good. The real key, though, is to spin things forward to next week, to be able to actually build off this and not just talk about it. I think that coming in this Indiana game, I definitely called it the softest landing that Penn State could have coming off that Ohio State game, with what Indiana was, how they'd been playing. And now you look at how this game ended, and now you're looking at Maryland next week. They've lost 3 straight games. People that are covering the team are calling it a free fall, pretty much with where they are right now. And so you think, okay, you close this game against Indiana in this fashion, and then you get to go to a place where you've been able to win before, and that you're going to have a pretty significant fan base be able to travel with you against a team that is reeling. In your head, it's like, okay, we can start to make this move. But this Penn State team hasn't shown us that they can really do that yet. So I think that it's hard not to get too far ahead of yourself coming off of this game. And I think that that's something from our perspective that there's still some, I think, dissection of what we saw today to really go through and figure out what this will look like moving forward. But I think the end result, getting out of here with a win, the way that they won at the end, I think that there's a lot of positives, and even some of the negatives, like looking at the defense, I think are anomalous. So I think that things are in a good spot right now. Like, life is good at 7-1, but the big thing that I want to see, what does the passing game look like after Drew Allar hits this one? Does the confidence there really travel to College Park next week?
Yeah, and does the confidence in general, is this a real thing? Did we see a team find something here in the last few minutes, or did we see a team avoid embarrassment, against a bad Indiana team, and maybe they're just kicking the can down the road because if they keep, if you see this string into the next week on the road or against Michigan, the results will not be as pretty. But at the end of the day, yeah, 7-1, and then let's focus really quickly on how they finished this and sealed the deal. It was on a 25-yard loss to a safety on a strip sack for denied Dennis Sutton, which ends up in the hands of a few defenders. Akeem Beeman, I would say, probably had the best shot to pick that ball up and get to the end zone for a defensive touchdown. But it ends up being a kind of a ping-pong situation, bouncing all over the place, rolls out the back of the end zone 35 yards later, and Penn State comes up with 2 points. It's 33-24. That seals the game. Denied Dennis Sutton talked about it after the game. Without Chop Robinson on the field, he felt like there was more responsibility on his shoulders. That play to him makes him feel like he made his brother proud. A cool little part of the story there. But I think generally this defense against Brendan Sorsby, the guy that not people have probably heard of, he threw for more yards in this first half against Penn State than any Indiana quarterback had in an entire game for about 5 weeks. And they get to the finish line here. They put the finishing touches on Sorsby, and you just get the sense that this defense knows they may have gotten away with one today. They know that they had some spots, they had some lapses. James Franklin talked about blown coverages. They gave up 3 touchdowns, and none of those touchdowns required Indiana to reach the red zone. And this is not an explosive Hoosiers defense or explosive Hoosiers offense. And so it was a kind of overall the probably the most underwhelming or frustrating defensive effort that we've seen from Penn State probably since last October, but they also finished the right way. And again, I just don't get the sense that this will fester for them like we've been worried about things festering for the offense.
You look at that safety, and I think maybe next time we're at practice, we're going to see Manny Diaz putting those linemen through the scoop drill that we saw, I think, pretty early after Diaz got here. But Yeah, I think looking at how this defense played, kind of like I just mentioned, I think that a lot of what we saw today were anomalies. I think that there are things that were kind of isolated incidents and things that you can look at and immediately be like, this is the cause, this is the effect, this is why it was a 90-yard touchdown. This is why Indiana had a 69-yard touchdown. I do think that the one touchdown drive early in the fourth quarter that made it a 24-21 game, I do think that's one you have to look a little bit closer at. That was a 12-play, I think 75 or 80-yard drive. Indiana made it look really easy. And then that touchdown was another one of these weird no man's land, tough coverage plays. So I think that this defense, I think that what we saw in the first 7 games is more indicative of what it was than what it was today. I think that that's more of their identity, who they are. At the same time, looking forward, you've got a Maryland team with Talia Tungavailoa and a couple dangerous wide receivers that can toss it around. So I'm sure that those missed assignments and blown coverages will be looked at very closely in film. But I think that it was one of those things where the mistakes were almost too obvious that when moving forward and dissecting this game from the defensive perspective, I don't think it's things that we're going to continue to see as opposed to some of the conversations we've been having about the offense.
Indiana had the first 2 possessions of the second half, 14 plays, 56 yards. That was a missed field goal. And then a 12-play, 80-yard drive that resulted in their 3rd touchdown. Prior to that, it was a 1-play, 69-yard possession and a 1-play, 90-yard possession. And that's what got Penn State in a bit of a hole there in the first half. And Daniel, when we review things in this game, the other part of the hole in the first half was just a slow start on offense. 3 straight punts to open this one, I believe it was. 3 straight punts. They get 19 yards on the first possession, 8 yards on the second possession. They lose 4 yards on the third possession before finding the end zone on drive number 4. But you've got that sleepy kind of start that we all figured was potentially looming for Penn State offensively. But then you look at the third quarter stats at halftime. They're 4 of 12, and you apply that to what we saw last week, and then you're on a run of 5 of 18 from third down in a 6-quarter stretch. And you got Drew Allar looking largely uncomfortable. I think he was 10 of 15 at one point before their first touchdown drive. Or after that first touchdown drive, but only 61 yards. Everything he was doing, they were working so hard to get, a 4 or 5 yard pass. They had 2 drops on third downs, one by Keandre Lambert-Smith, which obviously he made up for later on in the day, and then one by Harrison Wallace that brought out the punt team. That one was a little bit more well defended. Keandre Lambert-Smith was straight up drop, but Harrison Wallace on that drop was also injured, and we saw him return to the sideline in a sling, so he was out for the rest of the way, and he's been the unquestioned starter when available and healthy, opposite of Keandre Lambert-Smith. He played more snaps than anyone on offense, aside from those starting offensive linemen and Drew Allar. So he was out there involved as much as any skill player against Ohio State. This time doesn't make it deep into the game, and you have to wonder how long it might be until we see Harrison Wallace again. We'll talk about what else transpired at wide receiver next, but this is the guy that we've spent a ton of time saying, clearly James Franklin and company see something here. They want to give him every opportunity in the world to be a starter and to flourish in this offense. Hasn't really come to fruition. He had a bit of a hot start with 10 catches through 2 games. But now we're kind of, I guess, putting him to the side. When you see a guy show up on a sling and it's late October and we're running out of time for this offense to figure it out, that doesn't get any easier with Trey Wallace dealing with whatever he's dealing with.
Yeah, the challenges are going to keep coming for this wide receiver room, and guys are going to need to step up. We were talking about it before, where they need to kind of figure out the identity of this room, who the guys are that can contribute, and that kind of doubles down now. But I think that losing Trey Wallace is a big blow for this offense. Even if we weren't necessarily seeing production, we've heard so much about Drew Allar's trust in Harrison Wallace. I think that there is definitely a big level of comfort there. And anytime you remove a security blanket or something like that, it does change the equation a little bit. Even before Harrison Wallace went out, we were seeing a ton of 2 tight end sets from Penn State with Tyler Warren and Theo Johnson, and that continued, I think, into the game. It's going to be really interesting to see the snap counts even after Trey Wallace went out. So it puts Penn State into a tough spot, but it is kind of like what we talked about on Thursday in the preview pod, where we weren't seeing the production. So when you take him off the field, then there's just no production in general outside of Keandre Lambert-Smith. So, when you subtract there, it doesn't particularly change things. So I'm really curious to see what this actually looks like. We'll hear from James Franklin on Tuesday. Maybe we'll get an update on Harrison Wallace and what his outlook is then. But it does change things a little bit. You're removing someone who has trust with Drew Allar. The play that he got hurt on was a third down. That was something that we talked about from that West Virginia game, where Drew Allar was looking to Harrison Wallace on those kind of money downs. He was looking for him again there along the sideline, and Wallace couldn't haul in the pass and got hurt. But puts the wide receivers in the spotlight again. We talk about finally seeing an explosive play, but it doesn't necessarily answer a lot of the questions that we had about this offense coming into Saturday.
Yeah, obviously Keandre Lambert-Smith put his stamp on this game with the game-winning touchdown, 6 catches for 96 yards, and that score. Before that, though, you think about what his day looked like. He was under 40 yards receiving on the day on 8 targets, and no other receiver had more than 2 catches. In fact, the only other receiver who had a reception was Dante Cephas, 2 catches for 15 yards on the day on 5 targets. So on that, heading into that last possession, Daniel, you had Cephas with 2 catches for 15 yards. You had Lambert-Smith with 5 catches for about 38 yards. That was it for the entire wide receiver room. And you can kind of erase that narrative and rewrite it a little bit because of what Keandre Lambert-Smith was able to do, but it doesn't erase the fact that Dante Cephas here got a lot of run. We didn't see a lot of production again. That's kind of been the theme when he's had some opportunities here. Malik McClain showed up and played a lot of football on the perimeter with Harrison Wallace out. But I'm not sure he got a target. And if he did not get it, he doesn't have an official target here in the stat sheet. And if he did not, then that means his last target is September 16th at Illinois.
There's the one deep ball up the left side. I think that was Penn State's really only other big deep shot.
Right.
But before the last one. Yeah.
So not in the official stat sheet, but there you go. So McClain was what did finally get a target, but really that's it. I mean, it's not so much about the targets as it is about the catches, right? And we're just not seeing this group come up with them. Amari Evans didn't see him show up in a significant way here. I'll have to again look at the snap count, see who was involved. It's hard to tell all in real time, but if you wanted to look for some shuffling here, Dante Cephas was announced as a starter before the game here at Beaver Stadium. They still went with the 2 tight end set, but we did see Cephas involved early, and we saw him involved more often. But still more questions than solutions, I think, coming out of another matchup for this receiver group, especially when you pile onto that you may be missing Trey Wallace here for a little bit of time. I thought the offensive line allowed some glaring pressure moments, some spots where it seemed to be some miscommunication, perhaps. Basically free rushers getting to Drew Allar. It's not something that we've seen much this season. They were also dealing with some depth issues. Caden Wallace left early. I think it was after the 3rd possession of the matchup. Seemed to be in some physical discomfort. He did not return. And then Vega Ioane later on in the game, Daniel, you noted that he appeared to be dealing with something. Went to the sideline. It was J.B. Nelson and Salim Wormley at the guard spots down the stretch of this game. So 3 starters at the end of the day, left and did not come back. But focusing on the offensive line here, Daniel, look, the ground game numbers have not been what we thought. It was a little bit frantic today in the pocket at times for Drew Allar. 2/3 the way through this season, the offensive line certainly carries its share of the conversation about why doesn't this offense look like we all thought it might.
Offensive line play is so tough to evaluate, I think.
Sure.
And but the one thing that stands out to me is the fact that the results in the running game and seeing Drew Allar under some of this pressure. I mean, it's in no way is it like we saw in 2021. I don't think this unit has still massively improved. And I think that last year it really showed what it was capable of doing as well. Especially when you consider that down the stretch last year, they were just holding it together with scotch tape and glue with the number of guys who were out and the way they were shuffling things. And they had a true freshman starting at left tackle down the stretch. But I think this year's offensive line, I think that a lot of the miscues has been in kind of those, where they have to work together. I think that the chemistry for whatever reason when they're going against some games and stunts, things like that, especially on the interior. It doesn't quite come together. And someone smarter than me can probably diagnose it, but it is something that I think stands out a little bit more than we thought it would. I mean, the one play that I think both of us are thinking about was when Indiana basically had two rushers coming free up the middle because someone just ran right by Hunter Norzad. Early in the game, Penn State had a 3rd and 2 that they went for out of the tee, and a linebacker was just able to get in right behind the two blockers who were leading Nick Singleton. It's little things like that show up, can short circuit a drive and really put you in a tough situation.
Yeah, and then so I think what's worth noting here is the running backs. I thought they had a pretty good day. I mean, we're talking about still kind of searching for answers here in different parts of the offense, except for that late spark. But I felt like overall, even before that final possession, and I mentioned Kaytron Allen was key there, but Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, their touches were helping keep this offensive afloat. I think it was a bit of a rough start for Nick Singleton. Mark mentioned maybe 18 yards or so on the first 8 or 9 touches for Singleton. But he was an effective receiver. We're talking about looking for answers. And when Drew Allar is going downfield, Singleton had 5 catches, 31 yards. 4 of them were pretty short, and a couple of them lost yards. But his 28-yard gainer was a huge play, the kind of play that this passing game has been lacking so much. And now Nick Singleton is actually 19 receptions on the season. That ranks 3rd among all Nittany Lions. It only trails Theo Johnson and Keandre Lambert-Smith. I think he had 11 catches last year. He talked about it in postgame, just about how much he stressed this and emphasized it during the offseason. And now that he's been able to go out there, we haven't seen him, bust major plays. This was probably the biggest one we've seen through the passing game, but it's been notable to kind of counteract a little bit less of productivity, a lot less productivity as a runner. But he did get to 50 yards on 15 carries today, along with 7. That's not going to wow anybody. We're not seeing those typical Nick Singleton rushing stat lines by any means, but I thought today he gutted it out a little bit by contributing as a runner. He had a pretty solid blitz pickup at one point too that I noted. And then Kaytron Allen, 18 carries, 81 yards. Not a long, the 12 was his longest, but he had a couple key catches, including that 10-yard, 11-yard gain on the final possession. Again, I just think even though these guys haven't looked like the superstar, takeover game duo that we thought, I thought they kind of kept the Nittany Lions afloat while they had pieces, losing pieces on the offensive line, losing pieces on the wide receiver, having drops. I thought this group did a pretty good job, this tandem, of just giving something that they could count on, because it felt like they couldn't count on a lot during the course of this matchup.
I think some of it just goes back to volume. Last week at Ohio State, they combined for 20 touches offensively. Today they had 40. Kaytron Allen doubled the number of carries that he had from last week to this week. And we talked about him as a running back who can get better as the game goes on. As you wear down an opposing defense, he's someone who can find his way. And that first drive after halftime, he had close to 40 yards as Penn State went down the field. So I think that we saw Penn State feed those two backs. That was something that coming out of Ohio State, we talked about as something in the offensive game plan that left a little bit to be desired, given how good both of those players can be. And I think that we saw some sparks from Nick Singleton. He had that 28-yard gain through the air. I thought that was a really, really nice play by Drew Allar in terms of rolling, finding Nick Singleton over the middle and hitting him for an explosive gain. And then Nick Singleton had a 50-yard kickoff return. That was something else too that we hadn't really seen from him yet this year. We talked about Daquan Hardy in the punt return game, but Singleton and Potts and Allen hadn't quite broken anything or done anything too impressive on kick returns. And after Nick Singleton did that, Indiana never kicked to him again. So it was something that they definitely took note of, and another way that he was able to affect the game. So I'm not going to say that he's due anymore, because that was getting me in trouble these past couple of weeks with some predictions. But I think that we saw some positives from this running game, from the way that Singleton and Allen were running, but also from the way that they were being used, and that, how Penn State was trying to get them involved. I think that on a couple of those catches by Singleton, Drew Allar put him in some tough spots. I think that he lost 5 yards on one play where Allar checked it down and threw it out wide with the linebacker in Singleton's lap, essentially. But it does show that they're still cognizant of these two players. They want to get them the ball. And I think both of them showed that if Penn State needs them to make a play or help swing a game, they can do that.
They were able to help Penn State go 4 of 4 in the red zone, 35 minutes of possession, which is obviously a 10-minute advantage over Indiana in the course of this game. But let's be real. Even when you adjust and get rid of the sack numbers for their rushing totals, they're at 3.9 yards per carry against the Big Ten's basement dweller. And this is the third time now that Penn State has faced the conference's worst rush defense in that given week. And they continue to come up well shy of the average that team is allowing. So while I wanted to make sure we talked about Katron Allen and the impact he was able to make, same with Nick Singleton, you're still not getting anywhere close to the kind of fireworks, especially in a setting like this against a defense that appears ripe for the picking. Now, does Drew Allar throwing that bomb late change things? Does that change the way the defenses approach you? I mean, so much of what we talked about is the next side of this equation is, well, how do you unlock the run game? It's by opening things up with your pass attack. So something to look forward to. And in the last third of this season, starting with Maryland, is what can this offense find a way to recalibrate? It's kind of weird to hear an offensive a team being at such kind of a identity crisis at 7-1 on the side of the football, but that's really where Penn State is. I don't necessarily think they're out of that crisis because of what they did today, because of what they won. I think they avoided a major spiral situation, but now I think they've got a busy week ahead because it's just doesn't it feel like something's just missing? Doesn't it feel like, considering all the talent that's on the field and all the experiences on the field, they're not adding anybody and trying out these guys, most of them, except for like Dante Cephas and Malik McClain, they all played football last year, a bunch of it for the same offensive coordinator. And it's just feeling like week by week by week, it's tough. Maybe it didn't look so tough against West Virginia or Delaware or UMass, but now that we're starting to settle in and trying to say, here's what Penn State is in 2023, when I close my eyes and say, what does the offense look like? Last year, I was thinking of Nick Singleton running by every Auburn defender. Now I'm thinking about 3rd and 2 because that's where Penn State always seems to be. They don't pick up first downs on first down or second down. It's just 3rd and 2, maybe 4th and 2, and it's just grinding it out.
Yeah, it is just such a grinded out offense, and it's just not it's not aesthetically pleasing. You're not really, there's nothing that you're really hanging your hat on, because I think at this point, in terms of James Franklin talking about the identity being a grinded out kind of ball control team, staying on the field on 3rd down, I think we talked about how the sustainability of that is dubious at best, given the types of games that you can end up in and the types of opponents that you can play. But I think that something is still missing. I don't know if it's going to take someone breaking a big gain. I don't know if it's this Keandre Lambert-Smith pass, maybe moving some sort of mental block. I don't know if it's Drew Allar's interception suddenly changing things for him and then changing things for the rest of the offense. But it's just not easy. It's not it's painful. It feels disconnected. I do think that the game plan today and the quote unquote identity that they put out there, it felt a little bit more cohesive than we saw against Ohio State. We didn't see any trick plays.
Well, it should. You're playing Indiana and not Ohio State, right? I mean, here's the problem, Daniel. This is the get right game. I know that there's a lot that they just wanted to get through this week but it took way too long to get right. It took 58 minutes of football to get right for them offensively. And I'm still wondering, is that just because you got a 5-star quarterback talent throwing to a really good receiver against a bad defense that's overwhelmed in a situation? Or did they really find something here? I mean, this is kind of the situation that we all find ourselves in. And I know some of our listeners, are you buying Penn State as a 7-1 team going into November, ready to pursue a college football playoff berth? Or are you viewing Penn State as a 7-1 team whose trajectory is suddenly pointing down after the last 120 minutes of football, and you're really concerned about what November will look like? I'm not answering that question right now. I don't think you can. And that's kind of the really strange situation that we all find ourselves in. And a lot of college football programs will be envious of this spot, a top 10 ranking, and one loss on your radar right now. But I think a lot of fans are really anxious about it because they just don't know what to make of 2023 Nittany Lions.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. I think that in terms of a get right game, maybe this is what Penn State's right is this year, based on what they have and how they're playing and where the chemistry is. I think that we're kind of at the point where I think we've all sort of stopped being like, all right, this is when we're going to see it. This is, we're going to see the big plays. We're going to see this. We're going to see that. I think at this point, everything is, we'll believe it when we see it. And being 7-1 at this point in the year, thinking that you are a college football playoff contender, those first rankings come out in a couple days. I'm really curious to see where Penn State is, because on paper, sure, 7-1, 4-1 in the Big Ten. You're only lost to Ohio State. You took care of business through the first 6 games of the schedule. Okay, Indiana put a little bit of a scare into you, but who in college football hasn't gotten a scare yet this year? You can kind of rationalize things down on paper, but as people who are watching this every single week, you kind of, these past 2 weeks, you really left with kind of like, is this ceiling 10-2 again? Is the ceiling not 11-1 anymore? I think that Penn State being able to really get through this real clunker against a bad team, I don't think that this type of performance necessarily will happen again. Playing down that badly, just because getting this out of your system and actually doing it and surviving, I think there is something to be said for that. But this last quarter of the year, you look at the teams on the schedule, and last year in the last third, Penn State just blew the doors off everyone. But now you're like, well, Maryland can do some stuff on offense. Michigan, that's a whole other conversation. But then it's like Rutgers, what Rutgers did to Indiana and what Rutgers has done this season, you're kind of like, ooh, like that floor is a lot higher. Michigan State, probably that's also a separate conversation based on where they are. But this final third, it just feels a little bit dicey, I think, with Penn State coming off of these past 2 weeks. I think that by the end of the first quarter against Maryland, I think we'll know which way the arrow is pointing in terms of trajectory.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this defense performance, if we base it off of Manny Diaz's time here at Penn State, feels like an anomaly. It feels like it was a letdown week for them. I thought it was going to be the opposite. I thought it was going to be a week where they were tremendously edgy and they were going to come in and inflict some damage on Indiana. And it didn't happen that way. The defense just was not on its game in a way that we hadn't seen in a very long time, going back to last October against a much better opponent. But when I think what you wonder is, okay, well, the defense gets right, but what does the offense shake this off, or is just us the offense? And then that's kind of the question here. And again, with the quarterback who's got 19 total touchdowns and 1 interception, and he's a first-year starter, but he is the #1 overall quarterback prospect in the country. So we're not judging him as any other quarterback who's going to come into a college football program. And whether that's fair or not, that's where it is, and that's where the expectations were coming into the season. And when you think about the supporting cast around him and being able to elevate them, can it happen? Can they elevate Allar? I think that's probably been the question for me, Daniel, I thought it was an outside shot that Drew Allar could really elevate this offense on his own as a first-year starter within the first 8 games. If he did that, I mean, that's a big step. But I thought, to me, the supporting cast was going to be able to elevate Drew over the first 8 games of his starting career, whether that was the run game, a veteran offensive line group, a wide receiver position that they stockpiled with prospects and transfer players. And instead, we are entering November, and it feels like Drew's got to be the one to really pull the cart forward. And so you're dealing with all the psychological, emotional, physical toll of being a first-year quarterback and a starter and in this limelight. And now you're also being asked to be the one who carries the offense. It's not the equation that I think would have been the best suited for Penn State if they really wanted to make a push in November. If they were even just a little more balanced here, where Drew didn't feel like he had to be the guy. They were waiting for Drew Allar to make a play at Ohio State, right? Can we both agree on that?
Yeah.
They were waiting for Drew Allar to win them the game or to save them late. It wasn't looking for other pieces to pick up Drew in an adverse situation in Columbus. And the same deal today. They were leaning on Drew Allar to make some plays, whether that was passing the ball to his weapons like Nick Singleton or going deep in the late stages. We'll see what that recipe means and what Penn State can maybe do moving forward against Maryland, Michigan, Rutgers, and Michigan State, as you said. But before we get into November, I want to also do a quick tip of the cap to the special teams unit. Daniel, let's finish there. We have a lot to talk about on our next episode of the podcast. There's no doubt. We'll have Mark Brennan back on. We'll get into all the details we missed. Jalen Reed had a big interception. There's a bunch of individual splashes that I think we can do a better job of focusing in on Monday. But special teams, man, I mean, it's been a unit that has really helped out Penn State in ways that we didn't expect. It's been kind of one of those hang your hat on spots for them during the last few weeks. It feels like they had a 50-yard field goal from Alex Felkins as the first half expired. I think if he misses that field goal, or if they aren't able to get in field goal range, and they almost weren't because of a penalty there on Drew Allar, but they got points. And I think if they hadn't, the Beaver Stadium crowd turns on them. I think they get a major chorus of boos sending them into the locker room. What does that mean for them? How are they feeling about themselves when they come out of halftime? Instead, there was applause at halftime. So Felkins, big kick there, I thought. Riley Thompson, the punter, averaged 49 yards per punt. He had 250-plus, a couple inside the 20. Big return for Nick Singleton, which you mentioned, 50 yards. I think he feels like he should have scored a touchdown on that play. And then there was a punt return touchdown called back that Daquan Hardy had. It was the right call. Colin Dinkins blocked the guy in the back. But we continue to see the kind of threat that Daquan Hardy is. He brings a new dynamic to this special teams unit. And then there was another takeaway on a punt for the second consecutive week. They, were able to say, here, special teams unit, give the ball to Drew Allar at midfield. It didn't work out for them at Ohio State. It fizzled very fast, but this time they were able to cash in. So we got to give credit. I think we directed some concerns and questions towards Stacey Collins' unit during some of the earlier games this year, but it seems like they've found their footing. They found a new playmaker in the punt return game. And again, I'm going to keep going back to that kick that Felkins made in the first half. That really was important, I think, for this team upstairs. I just don't know how they feel if it's 14-14 at halftime and they feel like their entire community is against them. Whether they feel embarrassed or whether they feel like I just think it takes away from their ability to do what needs to be done during halftime. So I know I've hammered it home, but that kick from Felkins, to me, I think we can look back in the season and say if things go right, that was a really important moment for Penn State.
I think it was big for Felkins too because he'd missed that 51-yarder a little bit before, and he's talked about 55 being his limit. And I think based on what we've seen from him in warmups, that's true. And so you're going up against the end of his range. We don't have quite the same delineation as we've had in the past in terms of shorter field goal kickers and longer field goal kickers. It's Felkins' job right now. But I think to come back for him personally to rebound and make that kick, I think was really, really big. I think it put Penn State in a really good spot to be leading going into halftime. And I think that Felkins has just ended up being a very solid addition for them. I don't necessarily think he's the most kind of spectacular kicker. I think that he's brought a level of stability. It had been long enough between his misses on the block that I think that I felt a lot more comfortable with him now going into the final stretch of the season than maybe I did in that first month. But he made a couple big kicks at Ohio State last week, made a couple big kicks today, or made one big kick today. I think that he's adding some stability and is becoming a little bit of a weapon there for them, especially for an offense that isn't really finishing and isn't really putting itself in position to score many touchdowns. So yeah, I think Felkins has been good. I think Riley Thompson, he mentioned this week during his media availability that he changed something a little bit with the way that he was striking the ball. And that's kind of led to these past couple weeks where he's looked really, really solid. At the beginning of the year, it was a little touch and go at times, but he had one really nice kick today where he got it angled, caught right on the sideline. It took a couple Penn State guys to bring Jalen Lucas down, but Jalen Lucas is a really good returner. But I think just seeing Riley Thompson make that kind of kick shows that he's found his footing, and that maybe when James Franklin elects to punt on a kind of in between, or maybe they could go for it here, you feel a little bit better about putting Riley Thompson out there because you think that you'll get a result, kind of with what we had with Jordan Stout and Barney Moore the past 2 years.
Alex Felkins, by the way, Columbia's all-time leading point scorer before he came over via transfer. During that time in Columbia, though, 3 different years as a starting place kicker, never did better than converting 68% of his field goals. Now, through 8 games with the Nittany Lions, he's 10 of 13 That's 77% conversion rate. He is perfect from inside 40. 2 of those misses have come from beyond 50. One of them was blocked. So, yeah, I think you're getting probably more than you anticipated from Alex Felkins at this stage. We probably thought he was going to be the backup kicker, I mean, in all honesty, when he joined this roster last winter. And you can make the case that he has been pretty far and away the most impactful transfer addition to this roster. We're still waiting to see if Dante Cephas can pick it up. But you really look around, Trey Potts has made some plays, but game by game by game, Alex Felkins is the transfer who's been making the noise for the Nittany Lions. And Daniel, I think that's going to do it for us. I think we got to close up shop and turn the lights out here at Beaver Stadium before we get out of here. But anything else to add? 33-24 win, 7-1 record. But as we have gone through, just a lot of fine print with Penn State football these days.
You talk about still having a lot to talk about on Monday's podcast. Before we started recording, I started to take a gander through Mark Brennan's report card, and I think he's going to have a lot of things to say on Monday's episode. So that should be a fun one to close the book on this game. Look towards this last third of the schedule. It's going to be alma mater month for us, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to be excited about. But I think that to see where Penn State is, they're 7-1, kind of like I talked about last week. If you told us at the beginning of the year they'd be 7-1 going into this section of the season, we'd say they're right where they want to be. Obviously, that's not the case, but I think there's a little bit of signs, and I think the big thing for this team in this final month is going to be, are they going to put it all together? Offense, defense, special teams, within each of those units, like the running game, the passing game, run defense, pass defense. I think that is really what is going to determine what happens to Penn State. But hey, we've done 8 of these. It's gone by really fast, and I think it's going to be a furious finish here.
Yeah, well, it was a thrilling finish to the end of this matchup, to an overall frustrating performance for Penn State, but they get to the finish line with that victory. A bunch of people are going to lose money on the bet, but they take care of business on the win column. So we'll come back to you on Monday, break things down again, what we saw from Indiana upon further review. Daniel will put up his game rewind story at lions247.com between now and then. I'll have my game snaps story up early in the week as well. So we'll have a better scope, along with Mark Brennan, of what exactly took place during these 60 minutes, and we look forward to chatting with you then. For now, on behalf of Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue, stepping aside here in Beaver Stadium. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.